Now, welcome, Lee. Is it Tusman? Am I saying that correctly? Maybe C, maybe no. That's all right. No worries. Who is going to lead a session for us on zines, which is really super exciting because I think a lot of us grew up with zines, making zines, experiencing zines. So he's going to talk on zines and preservation and the DIY communities that form, and then we're going to create a zine together. So take it away, Lee.
Hey, thanks for having me. My name is pronounced Lee Tusman, although I do accept Tusman as well, and it's my moniker in various websites. I'm going to share my screen in a second. My topic is similar to what you said, but it is slightly different. Give me 1 second. I'm going to both drop a link to my slides, which do have descriptions in them, into the chat now, and I will make this accessible afterwards on Discord as well, or feel free to drop this to Discord. And I'm just going to kind of launch it right now. Give me 1 second here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see my slides. You should see on the screen, it says DIY approaches to preserving creative communities online, a workshop with an image in black and white. You see this?
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. Yeah, this is my talk is on DIY approaches to preserving creative communities online, a workshop. Here there is an image of Community Memory, a 1970s project to create basically a digital bulletin board system. The first community network, digital network that worked like this. You see two people sitting in front of a bulletin board in a record shop in Berkeley, California. And the bulletin board has flyers stapled up everywhere. There's one that's advertising lessons. There's another area that says miscellaneous. What they are looking at and sitting in front of and interacting with is a computer that's called Community Memory, that was a digital computer terminal and network of computers where anyone could post you could insert a quarter, anyone could post an announcement. I know how to make bagels. I'm looking for poets. I'm looking for a bass player. I am a bass player, for example. And this was very active in the late 70s through the 80s up until the early 90s across Berkeley. And this has been a big inspiration for me for a lot of my projects. I'll get back to this in a little bit. Okay, so today for this workshop, here's what I'm going to do. There's going to be a little bit of an intro. I'm going to show some examples of archiving online creative work and DIY artist communities. I'll talk about some tools. Ideally, with the assembled folks, we'll have a little bit of a jam session where we work on stuff and then a show and tell. This was my goals for the day. We'll see how it goes. This is an unconference, and I'm really open to kind of breaking this, and I'm very flexible. I do have the chat open. I don't have Discord open simultaneously, but I do have the chat open. So if you want to put questions or comments in there while we're going, or even speak out loud, unmute yourself and talk, that's all okay as well. The first part is me presenting a little bit of information, and then the second part is ideally us working. So this workshop comes out of a long-term project I've been working on. I've been involved with DIY artist-run organizations and communities for a few decades. I'm based in New York City. The two groups that I work with here in New York, one is called Baby Castles, which is a art space, a DIY art collective dedicated to experimental games, including we have an event once a month called Word Hack that people here might have attended either online or in person, that's dedicated to experimental and interactive text, fiction, and performance. And I'm also involved with a group called Flux Factory, which is about 2 decades old. It's actually a little bit older than that, maybe a quarter century. It's an artist-run space here in New York. And During the pandemic, as a lot of DIY spaces around the world closed, and have also been affected by things like gentrification, precarity, lack of funding, capacity, a lot of the activities of these DIY spaces disappear, particularly if they're mostly documented online. The other thing is I've been a part of online art communities now for a few decades, and the same thing can happen to online DIY creative communities. These could be experimental art, collage, video games, interactive fiction. These have a lot of the same issues. They're affected by precarity as well, though one of the largest things to affect them is link rot, platforms changing, passwords being lost, or when a corporation buys a platform and then allows it to wither and maybe even changes its economic framework and destroys it. For example, that one I'm thinking of GeoCities, but even recently Flickr changing the terms of their service and allowing you to only have a certain number of photos or a certain number of private photos. And I have experience working for museums for about 15 years. I'm a professor now, and prior to working as a professor, I worked for museums. And I worked both in curatorial as well as with their archives of artwork. So I have some experience working physically with materials. And I've been trying to translate, albeit in a ad hoc DIY and constantly reforming and learning technique on my own, learning and thinking about and testing out different ways to archive the works of various communities. Communities in particular that don't necessarily have institutional support. And as part of that, I went back to the beginning of what an archive is. And I'm thinking about early archives as these Wunderkammers. Essentially, in my own words, these are collections of materials that people saved, sometimes put in their house. These might have been wealthy patrons, but not necessarily. All kinds of people collect and save objects from the organizations, groups, or clubs that they're part of. Over time, these things were consolidated and became parts of museums or libraries or archives. We've seen some examples, and many of us know about zines, which are, I think, again, of DIY, do-it-yourself, photocopied collections of personal anecdotes, stories, comics, resources, collections, recipes, all kinds of things. And I have several boxes of zines actually sitting next to me. I'll stop sharing my screen and show something for a second. If you could mute yourselves just for a moment, and then I'll let people talk a little bit. Okay, I've pulled some zines here. I have Library Excavations. This is by Mark Fisher from Public Collectors. This issue is Montana Prison News. Mark primarily makes these on risograph machines. They're beautiful. He's been doing these for dozens of years. I have a tiny zine that's a little folding zine by Queer AI. It says, "What do you know about intergenerational trauma?" A conversation with Queer AI. And it's a conversation between a chatbot and the Queer AI team. And I'll show maybe just one more. This is Deft Esoterica TQ. This is largely an experimental music zine with interviews with different practitioners that create collage and experimental sound art. Okay, that's maybe enough for today of zines. I'm going to go back to my presentation again. When thinking about archiving the work of different communities, one thing that I've been thinking about is the shoebox approach versus the display cabinet approach. And then how does that translate online? And I'm in the chat, people are putting some great stuff. Alan wrote about news groups serving as useful as these kind of extremely active communities, hundreds of thousands of them, and then many of them gone, including their archives. And also mentioned Fact Sheet 5, a long-running zine that archives other zines. And yeah, and Dean is mentioning thinking about shoebox archives and digital archives. And I'm going to show how I've translated some of these shoe boxes versus display cabinets to these web archives. Okay, just to start, this is the Electronic Literature Collection, Volume 1. Give me 1 second because I've lost my speaker notes. I'm so sorry. Here they are. This is the Electronic Literature Collection, Volume 1, organized by the Electronic Literature Organization. And I wanted to show this as an example of an archive. Not necessarily, DIY, but this is an archive made by a community of work from its community, right? And even extending to others. And interested in this idea of preservation, of trying to hold on to born digital work and keep it living for the long term. This is from, in my mind, a great example of an archive. It chooses, it's not trying to necessarily select everything, it's trying to select a collection. They're making some choices, and we'll look at examples of what an individual page might look like, of what an archived work looks like in a second, but this shows you an overview of this collection. This is the first, and yes, there are now 4 of these electronic literature collections that have been created. I have a work in the 4th one, actually. I'm really excited about that. I'm going to jump to textfiles.com. I like the questions listed on the front page of textfiles.com. Where are the files? Who are you? Why does this matter? What was it like? And how can I help? What was it like is a big one for me. And this question is about what is this scene making? What is this scene creating? What is this community? What's the intellectual work? What's the creative work that's being done? That's how I interpret this collection. This partly as well as how does it feel, right? And usually great archives of work, they are able to kind of convey both of these things. It says here, on the face of things, we seem to be merely talking about text. We seem to be merely talking about text-based files containing only the letters of the English alphabet and the occasional punctuation mark. On deeper inspection, of course, this isn't quite the case. What the site offers is a glimpse into the history of writers and artists bound by the 128 characters that the American Standard Code for Information Interchange allowed them. The focus is on mid-1980s text files and the world as it was then, but even these files are sometimes retooled 1960s and 70s works, and the offshoots of this culture exist to this day. It's great people know who Jason Scott is, who creates textfiles.com, and that he was a speaker. That's really cool. One of the pages on textfiles.com says the text file writing groups. And there's a text description here of how groups of close internet friends in the 80s work together, online communities, work together, forming informal groups and publishing files on online bulletin board systems under their group names. Some of the examples below are 9X, Anarchy Incorporated, the Banana Republic BBS collection from New Zealand. At the bottom, it says, if you wish to have the entire directory conveniently archived and compressed into one file, so it explains how you can download it. So this is Jason's attempt to archive a large number of online bulletin board systems that you would dial into around the world. One of the things I like about maybe Jason's description too is that it kind of acknowledges that it's just his collection and that these are things that were informal. They weren't necessarily meant to be archived. And I think that's one of the themes we'll see in general, other than the electronic literature collection at the beginning. Many of these works that I'm showing were not originally meant to be archived, but people realized over time that it was important for them to archive it. And there's various reasons why we might want to archive things. This is the Museum of ZZT. ZZT was a text mode game from 1991 created by Tim Sweeney of Epic Games. And it has its, who is now the maker of Unreal Engine. And I believe bought Bandcamp.com this last year. ZZT has its own editor and scripting language, which offers what may still be an unmatched level of accessibility to beginning game developers. A significant number of ZZT worlds were created by authors in their early teenage years, with some being made by children under 10. ZZT's simple ZZT object-oriented programming scripting language gave many a friendly introduction to programming. The goal of the Museum of ZZT site is to collect these worlds, offer discussions into them and the community built around them, and keep them safely preserved. It is the hope of the museum that the generally unknown works of ZZT community can be easily discovered and that their importance can be recognized. And underneath is a grid of ZZT games with screenshots and the titles of those works. And it says new releases, new finds. So you can see that this is a living archive that's constantly being changed. After this is one called the Glorious Trainwork Software Collection. We're looking here at an Internet Archive page. So one of the tools I'll be talking about today, and one of the things that we can use are the various tools of archive.org, the Internet Archive. They have lots of different kind of archiving tools. So this is the Glorious Trainwork Software Collection. And below it is a description of what Glorious Trainwrecks is, which is a community that I'm actually a part of. The description says, Glorious Trainwrecks is about bringing back the spirit of post-hardware circa 1993. It's about throwing a bunch of random crap into your game and keeping whatever sticks, about bringing back a time when you didn't care so much about production values, as much as ripping sound samples from your favorite television shows to use in your game, or animating pictures of yourself making goofy faces on your webcam. Where every ridiculous idea you had, you would just sit down and code. It goes on from there, but I believe the birth of Glorious Trainwrecks was as an online bulletin board community of people trying to make games in 2 hours or less using whatever tools that they had. It still exists, it's still a really active online community. This was an attempt at collecting some favorites over the years, and this is on the Internet Archive. And you'll see some screenshots from some of the games: a blackthorn and his blob, a boy and his rhinoceros, Aladdin hates penguins, a very velociraptor Christmas. If you're not familiar with Glorious Trainwrecks, hopefully you're getting a little bit of the flavor of this community. And a bunch of you in chat recognize Glorious Trainwrecks, are excited about it. That's great. That brings me pleasure. I'm going to go to a page on Glorious Trainwrecks. This is a screenshot that I took recently of what a typical page on the Glorious Trainwrecks website looks like. The website is at least, I think it's at least 15 years old, or at least the community's been active for about 15 years. And these are, you know, in this screenshot, you see a bunch of games that have been posted recently. Clown Party 2, Black Screen. At the bottom, there's Binky 27, Die Wunderkammer vom Binky, the Cabinet of Curiosities of Binky. That was created in July this year and posted. Yeah, that's an incredible title. So this is what the website looks like now. If I jump back again, this is an archive of some favorites over the years of works from the Glorious Trainwrecks community. Why might we do this? Again, we might do this because a website could go down. The platform could, like, literally you could lose access to a domain. The person running the website or hosting the site could disappear. Someone could forget to pay a bill. Or you might want a way to display it to other communities in various ways. And again, there's a difference between this website here that everything's hosted on versus this archive that's been created on archive.org. Next, I'm going to jump to the Bulletin of the Serving Library. This is organized by a trio of people. I believe it's called Dexter Sinister. It's a website. It's a book. In fact, let me pull my book out. I'm holding up the latest issue of the Bulletin of the Serving Library Annual 2022-2023. with a picture of one of these New York style paper mugs that says, "It's our pleasure to serve you." On the back is a picture of the archive of what's inside of this book. And these items also appear on the website too. So this is a physical archive of materials. It's also this digital archive that you see on the screen that I'm sharing too. Each time you reload their website of the Bulletin of the Serving Library, you see a different collection of materials that have been collected. And all of these materials you see on this website are actually in a physical location too, I believe in Belgium. And so this is an archive of experimental artists' works and writing and artwork and design, among other things. All of these things are united in that they're not large mainstream institutions necessarily. These are collections made by people or individuals or small groups of their particular communities and interests. This is the Rave Preservation Project. This is a website that attempts to catalog and collect rave flyers, paper, physical ones, as well as online digital ones too. It claims to be the largest collection of rave flyers in the world, and it's a rave and underground memorabilia archival project. On this screenshot here of the landing page, you'll see an example flyer. Each time you visit this site, a different one, I think, appears on the top. You can click and they let you sign in to view more flyers and posters. If I'm not mistaken, that's the approach that they've taken to avoid some issues I think they've had with copyright, or at least that they fear. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the legal issues later if people are interested. On the right, they had a fundraiser to keep this project going, and they raised $6,000 on GoFundMe. Drink some water. This is the Queer Zine Archive Project. The Queer Zine Archive Project is a website. It says that it was first launched in November 2003 in an effort to preserve queer zines and make them accessible to other queers, researchers, historians, punks, and anyone else who has an interest in DIY and underground queer zine culture. Each time you visit the page, it picks a random selection of zines to show on the front. In this image, we see Fuzzbox and the queer fanzine Rose Lenten 97 Special. To my eyes, it has a certain punk aesthetic, a xerography aesthetic here. You can browse. There's a search, there's an about, help, and a blog. And I think of these are actually some fairly good categories. You can browse, I like that. A blog, in other words, some writing where people kind of write about their selections and what they're doing. And an about, I think of as a good way to contact people. Yeah, definitely links in with, in the chat, someone's mentioning, Lyle's mentioning, it links in with artist books, definitely. This is an in-progress archive I'm making. Little Berlin was a DIY artist-run community in Philadelphia for over a decade, and it closed during the pandemic, and the website went down. The people that were running it at the end either didn't pay their bill, but the site went down, and thank God I had been making sure it got added to the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. And so I was able to pull down much of the website, even though it was built on Squarespace, a platform that does not really allow you to export its code. And I was able to recreate most of the website, almost all of it, in fact, and then add some other materials from the years. So this is an archive that's literally just an exact copy of, as close as possible with some additional material of this artist-run community that was active for over a decade with dozens of exhibits and art projects, and its own zine library. This is another archive. This is a screenshot of the experimental archive space. This is one that I've built. The website is experimentalarchive.space, and it's an archive of Space 1026, which is a long-running DIY art community in Philadelphia, again, where I'm from. And I scraped Flickr, Instagram, Twitter, where else? I think Foursquare and some other spaces, and I had a collection and their website. and I collected about 15,000 images. And I also did an interview with members of the collective over Zoom, as well as a few past members. And I used transcription software to transcribe those interviews to build this website. So again, this differs from their website, which is space1026.org. This is experimentalarchive.space. This is meant to be another archive that that takes more of a kitchen sink or shoebox approach. I'll show you that here in a second. One part of the website are these kind of interviews. Another part is this this shoebox of photos that randomly pulls out a bunch of photos, again, that I scraped from the internet. And you can sift through them and move them out of the way. But you can also browse this way. This is a zine that's created in the zine making software that I have on the website that pulls text from the interviews I did with members of the collective. So you can read about the space, what it's still in existence, it's still in Philadelphia. You can read about the space, you can read about how it's organized, how it works, what they did, what their activities are. That was part of this archiving aspect for me. This is another archive. This is the Prelinger collections. I believe it's Alan Prelinger, if I'm not mistaken, who's collected all of these old movies, particularly home movies, and uses the Internet Archive to store these movies. There's 8,599 videos and films archived using the Internet Archive's website here. Dina is pointing out that organizing to find material is so important for accessibility as well. I would agree with that. It's something we can talk about in a little bit, some different approaches to how one might build their own archive. After that is UbuWeb. UbuWeb is over 2 decades old. It started as a way to share avant-garde art and film, but it morphed into something a bit stranger. It's largely built off of files that are collected from torrenting and the like. Informally distributed files online, videos, text, things like that. And in the screenshot here, we show the landing page of UbuWeb. To my mind, this is a very minimal late 1990s style website. I believe that's John Cage in the top left. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's John Cage looking down. It says UbuWeb, all avant-garde all the time, and it has its categories. Recent additions. Oh, it's Samuel Beckett. Thank you. Film and video, sound, dance, papers, historical, visual poetry, conceptual writing, contemporary, Aspen magazine. Hopefully you're getting a little flavor that these categories are, hand selected, right? Outsiders, Ubu Editions, the 365 Days Project, Bazoon Presents, Ethnopoetics, Electronic Music Resources, UbuWeb Top 10s, a link to Twitter, UbuWeb Radio Stream, the Ubu Radio app, resources, and contact. I want to point out that, again, these are hand-selected kind of categories of material because archives there's no one way to do it. They are handmade, and they're made by making selections and kind of intuitively working at times. This collection was largely built off of other kinds of collections. For example, Aspen Magazine was a contemporary multimedia magazine that was shipped with film reels and zines and photographs and postcards and coins and artist multiples. The 365 Days Project was an already online project that was looking to close its website that contacted, if I'm not mistaken, contacted UbuWeb and asked to be kind of preserved and archived by them. And a few comments in the chat Alan says it reminds you of Richard Castellanettes, who has between 1 to 2 million books, texts, and objects. Yes. This is a archival project called the Art Spaces Archives Project, ASAP. Unfortunately, this website is down in the sense that you can't go to as-ap.org anymore. It only exists on the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive. And it's sad because it's such a recent archiving project to archive DIY art spaces. and it was founded by a consortium of alternative art organizations, including BOM Magazine, the College Art Association, the Franklin Furnace Archive. It was supported by the New York State Council on the Arts, NYSCA, New York State Artist Workspace Consortium, and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. It's really ironic, Dean is pointing out that the Archives project is not itself archived and can no longer be accessed. It can be accessed, thank God, through the Wayback Machine. It's with a mandate to help preserve, present, and protect the archival heritage of living and defunct for and not-for-profit spaces of the alternative or avant-garde movement of the 1950s to the present throughout the United States. In certain ways, this is a model of an archive, and in other ways, it's not, because it was only archived by Internet Archive before it went down. Yeah, people are pointing out in the chat some of the different archives that exist, like at MoMA and NYU. One of my goals is to link up with various archives. One is the Internet Archive, but other institutions as well, Library of Congress, for example, and other museum archives to work to preserve different kinds of online archives as well. This is a photo of Los Angeles Contemporary Archive, or LACA. LACA challenges established concepts of the archive and art institution. They're an artist-run archive. They're a physical space, and they sustain a unique experimental environment for critical inquiry, artistic research, and public dialogue. LACA is an art archive, it's a library, and it's an exhibition space, and it's located in Chinatown, Los Angeles. In this photo, you can see shelving on the left with all these different artist books and materials. When artist spaces in Los Angeles close, they send their materials. They often send their materials to LACA to be collected. Is that in the background or foreground? Well, straight ahead in this image, you can see shelves that are showing open books you can go in and study and explore, with artist books and multiples and binders of materials. They actually have a lot of resources online as well. I believe it's lacaarchive.com. I linked to it if I click here, but I'm afraid to do it because I'll be taken out of my presentation. But there is a link to the LACA archive where you can, they have resources on how to do archiving, as well as what their collection contains. And through talking with them, I learned about the importance of physical archives too, right? So even if a website goes down, having an archive of your materials can be important. And that can look like, I'm gonna pull an archive of a DIY run space in LA called Coaxial Arts Foundation, which is a video art and media art based DIY art space in LA. They have a book that catalogs their work over the years. But there are also zine approaches to printed zine approaches to archiving one's activities and community as well. There are different examples of that over the years. Do I have one I can show close at hand? For example, I've made tools, and there are various tools to make your own zine ones. That was why I built that into the experimental archive space too. So you could print out zines to distribute as well as archives. Okay, so I have some questions that are guiding my work when I'm trying to create archives, and as I think about what I want to archive and that I think might help other people too. There's more questions than this possible, but here's some of the beginning questions that I ask myself. What is the work that's being done by this community? Are people making games, interactive fiction, experimental websites? What's the work being done? And then why is it important to me or to a community? Why do I want to preserve this? What, you know, Do I want to collect everything? Do I want to collect a small amount? Do I want to just write about it? What's the part that's important to me that I want to, do I want to show what the people? Do I want to link to the people? Yeah, so this comes to what works do I want to preserve? Am I trying to preserve everything or a small selection? Or am I trying to preserve the actual website itself in some way? Or is this an analog that will go with it? The next question is, what resources do I have? Do I have access to the community? Do I have a server? Do I have programming skills? Do I have experience doing digital design? Do I, I'm trying to avoid saying photoshopping. Can I do, do I know how to collect things, right? What help do I need? Using the skills that I have and maybe don't have, what other additional kinds of help do I need? Who do I need to reach out to or could reach out to that could also provide some help? Because there are lots of people working on these issues as well in various kinds of ways. But I do want to keep in mind that often I think gumption is more important than technical skills. I really do. I don't know if everyone shares this, but as we've seen already, we look back at some of these other ones, a lot of collections or archives or works disappear because people didn't stop to try to collect them or preserve them in various ways. And we all know that the web is really hard to preserve. Link rot is so real and such a something we've been living with for a while that just trying to do something is actually, the first step I think is the hardest step, to be honest. What are some of the things you might want to preserve? These are some of the things I think about. You might want to preserve interviews, which could be oral history, or it could be Tina wrote, you cannot download the internet. You can try, you can't download all of it. You can download parts of it. Yeah, what do you want to preserve? You might want to have interviews with people that are part of the community, or might want to just preserve a conversation. Or you might want to just write from your own perspective about what this community is and what they make and what it means to you. Articles and text files, these could be blog posts, these could be electronic literature, these could be descriptions of the material that you're trying to preserve or save. Images, and images should always have descriptions when possible. And other media. There could be other things you might want to preserve as well. This is just kind of a starting list to make it seem simple. Simple is not the right word, but to make it seem not daunting. How do you do it? There's a few approaches. One is using the Internet Archive, piggybacking off of their archiving ability. Again, using the Wayback Machine or using Archive It, a little bit more industrial tool for large scale archiving. If you go to the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive's website, you can put in the URL of any page and you click save, and it will save a snapshot of that website, including a screenshot. If you select that, you can check that off, a screenshot, some metadata, and the HTML and CSS, and attempt at saving the JavaScript of the website that you're viewing. You can preserve using other platforms. I wrote Boo here, and again, this comes from my fear that platforms, particularly with freemium models, might change their model over time and might kill off a tool that's been used, or kill off a platform, or change their economic model, or lock it up. And you might all have other ideas of how you want to archive things. You can put those in the chat or say them out loud, and we'll give some time for that. I also want to mention accessibility, something that's been talked about a lot during this Unconference so far. And these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, which is how can you make things clear with useful text descriptions? and then thinking through your system and implementing it consistently. There are best practices and tools for accessibility. You don't need to figure this out from scratch, but I always keep in mind that plain text and images with useful descriptions will get you really far. I don't think that I don't want people to worry about accessibility and make them stop from trying to do archiving work. And one of the reasons is I think you can get really far with just plain text and then folders of images. That's not necessarily an archive alone, but it can be. It's one approach. And so thinking about this idea of a shoebox versus a curated personal zine, a shoebox collects everything, maybe. You know, you stuff your shoebox with photos, zines, postcards, flyers, and you just shove it in there, or a banker's box, or your vault, or your safety deposit box, right? That's one approach. You know, or the basement, you shove it in there. The other approach is this curated personal zine archive. Along with having like a little bit of an intro text describing what your collection is, why it is, what's important, what you're trying to preserve. Here's some of the tools that I use. There are scraping tools. There is open source code that you can use online, and then there's commercial freemium models. Octoparse and Scrapestorm are ones I've used. Octoparse, Scrapestorm looks like it works pretty well too. These are tools you can use to scrape metadata. You can scrape photos. You can scrape text. Often these platforms don't want you to do this if you're using a closed platform. It's not illegal to do so, but it is against their terms of service usually. So they will block your IP address. With some of these tools, they hide your IP address. The Wayback Machine, I've mentioned it a few times, which is run by the Internet Archive, is a great way to save websites. Conifer and Web Recorder are two different tools to archive web-based work. These are tools that can do kind of screenshots and screen grabs, and also make kind of a virtual machine that saves a website on a computer. There's a question here. What happens if the Wayback Machine breaks down? I think that's a really good question. For the archives that I build, I do a combination approach where I have my own server, but you know, again, I'm just a person, but I'm making my own copy of this archive. And then I also have a copy on the Internet Archive, and it's also why I'm working to try to find a long-term library archive that would want to work with me on providing accessible tools for archiving different organizations and communities and online spaces. Making, at the beginning, I showed textfiles.com. Jason Scott has made kind of torrent files of the entire textfiles.com that live on the internet too, so that there could be other copies. I know that there's a book that came out about a year ago from the UbuWeb's creator, Kenneth Goldsmith, and in that book, he describes how he shares server space and makes backups with other DIY archives, including like Radio Web Machba's Sound Archive. I might be getting their name incorrectly, and other online communities that are trying to preserve things online, Monoscope, I believe, and some other ones. One thing that I want to emphasize here that I don't hear many people talk about a lot is plain text. Plain text just means literally that, text. A lot of things underlying the web, in fact, all of the web underlying it is just text, as we know. And a lot of what we do on computers are text. And I don't just mean that the web, you know, is built on HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which is written as text. I mean that literally we can use text, and that will take us really far. You know, text is obviously read by screen readers. It's what's searched. It's what's used to create metadata. But writing text and scraping text is actually a huge part of archiving, in my opinion. I myself write in something called Markdown. Probably a lot of people are familiar with this. Markdown is very similar to plain text with a few additional little characters that you add to show that something's a headline, bolded, a link, an image, anything else, or a list item. It just has a few of these special characters. What's great is that it can turn into a website, or it can just stay as text and be readable as text or printed out as text. In my mind, plain text and working with Markdown are ways that I try to make long-term accessible things. Even if Markdown got broken, it's still really mostly just text. My own in-progress website on these archiving projects, and again, these DIY archiving projects, is archiving artist spaces. And I have a list of tools, and I also have a development log there of my in-progress work. Here's what I was, I've just been speaking for about 45 minutes. Here's what I was hoping we could do with the rest of this time. And I'm open to other ideas as well. What I was hoping we could do are have a little bit of a discussion on different communities that we're a part of, different archives that we've seen, and different attempts that we've taken in our lives to create kind of personal archives of the online creative communities that we're a part of, or the in-person IRL communities that we're a part of. What are some of the communities we're a part of? What are the things that we are thinking about? But I'm really open to other kinds of ideas as well too. People have been talking in the chat. I think I'm just going to open it up for a little bit for a discussion, and seeing how that goes. That might lead to us doing a little activity as well. But I just wanted to first start with a little bit of a discussion and kind of open it up. So I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second and just see if people have comments or feedback or want to talk about archives in various ways. Yeah, I see Alan.
Yeah, this is something, because I'm turning 80 in a couple of weeks. This is something that I've been dealing with, and it's driving me absolutely crazy. To give you an example, I have a 500-year-old book here that's in perfect shape and readable. I have, on the other hand, I've got some hard drives that, maybe hold 10 megabytes each, that are really old and are completely unreadable at this point. And readability is really a mess, particularly in the areas of video and film. Those things tend to deteriorate, splices break, and the restoration process is killing also for photography. But I think also a lot of digital media, a lot of the older stuff that you find, you go to a flea market or something, and you end up buying an old hard drive, and most of the time you can't read them. So a tremendous amount is lost. And then online, even with the preservation going on, when you look for news groups, because I used to be active on those and was fascinated by the communities, the interlaced communities that formed then within them, you can't find it. Google bought them out. Google then relegated them. A lot of them you literally have no access to at all. So I think in a way it's a great thing to try to preserve these, but I think it's also ultimately sort of hopeless, and that you have to accept that enormous amounts of information are being lost daily. I'm also thinking of like the Russian mill bloggers and the hackers in the Ukraine war, because this is something I've been writing about and thinking about a lot. And that stuff is not even surfaced. You can't get access to it. So there's the so-called dark net, things like that. It's almost impossible to access that. So we're skimming a surface with all of this, which I think is great, but it's still a surface. I'm at a loss because I'm dealing constantly with conservators and things like that, and it's a mess.
I can respond to that, but I'm open to other comments too. Yeah, I mean, I worked at a contemporary art museum that had about 10,000 items in its collection, including kind of early modern art that was kind of interactive sculptures that were kinetic and things like that would kind of break. we had paintings by like Magritte, like the great surrealist, and they were like decaying because he had painted one part, before the paint had dried. He had put another layer of paint, and part of the painting was getting like eaten away. I've been in situations where there have been floods in the archives of various museums I've worked at. And so in certain sense, there's a parallel, there's some dramatic differences from online, like archiving things digitally in various ways, but there's also some of these kinds of parallels too. I'm also thinking about early archives. They're literally just collections of people, right? And so much is lost and disappears. And I really do think it feels very overwhelming, but I also think it's an opportunity for us. I don't know if opportunity is the right word, but I do think there's the ability for us to also try to preserve and share what's important to us and our community, so that we can kind of learn from the past, and because it actually has implications for the work that we do now and in the future as well too. So it is something that can be really daunting, but it still feels worthwhile to me to try to do. If that makes any sense? Alan, you're muted. You're muted, Alan.
If you want to save anything for eternity, work in ceramics or stone. You have stone tools that go back, 2 million years, things like that. And ceramics, old ceramics, work in cuneiform. It'll stay forever.
I've got one word: plastics.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, I'm actually converting one of my works, Carving Impossibilities, to plastic jigsaw puzzle. So that, I can bury it and somebody might bring it up someday. But thank you so much for all of this talk with archiving. It's so important. And there's so much that we can talk about with, like, for example, intentional performances that won't be archived, that are lost. It's like, okay, let's really think that through. But yeah, I don't know if there are other questions, or if you wanted to go into your
I'm happy
do?
to. Let me just see if there's any other comments or questions or feedback people are thinking of.
No, I just have a comment on this. It's like, if possible, it's very good to have a backup. That's usually an aspect of an archive, which is usually not. I mean, we are usually not able to deal with it, because it's usually expensive enough to have enough terabytes for the archive itself. But in this electronic media, it's they are very unstable, and it's good idea to have the right system of disks. That's one thing, and another, to have a geographically distant backup. It's like super important thing.
Absolutely. I know for myself, I after years of knowing this, I actually do it now. I bought 2 external hard drives, and I have my like kind of online server space and personal computer, and then those are both backed up to 2 hard drives, which I do about once a week on one and once a month on the other. And I basically commute back and forth to my university, and I leave, the physical one of the hard drives at my office at school. Lyle, did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just interested in the aspect of you were saying to preserve and archive what is important to us. And I just wonder if there's inherent inequalities of what is preserved based on those criteria, because as we know, there's already inequality in who has access to digital media and who has capabilities, and so much of the world, more than 50% of the world, only has access to the internet through a mobile device, and that definitely affects what we can archive and what they can archive and what they can access and that sort of thing. So you know, as we're finding with games and early electronic literature, so much of it is primarily North American. And that's because in no small way because of a digital divide. Yeah, so those kind of some of my thoughts on that sort of how do we approach what to archive.
That's a really good comment. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about Wunderkammers. These, you know, again, my understanding I don't speak German, but my understanding is these are like, again, I translate this as cabinet of curiosities. And these were largely, is that right? Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. And these were largely collections by aristocratic white men in Europe and in the United States as well. And these would be personal collections of what interested them personally. And then those items would get consolidated, they would pass away, and their children or grandchildren, they would be sent to a historical collection, locally, and then those would get consolidated at these early museums that started to form. And so these museums were, and many still are, largely collections of these aristocratic white men and their personal, preferences and interests, right? And so we do want to avoid these kinds of problems. Some of the archives I showed were from communities very different than that. And I think part of my goal and interest is that if we don't archive these DIY alternative communities that are precarious or marginalized, not all of them are, but many are, then they can be lost very easily and maybe not shared with this wider community, not given I don't want to say given a place in history, because I don't know if that's the kind of dialogue or the way that I want to frame it, but at least engaging with that history and maybe not shared as widely. And so part of my agenda with kind of archiving is being able to figure out ways to preserve these communities and providing tools for communities to archive themselves and to share what they're working on. But yes, I think your point is really well taken. And it's really important to think through, who's doing the archiving and what are they archiving, and what problems, maybe problems not the right word, what biases can be promulgated that way as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think it would be worth doing an exercise now. I could use some activity.
Okay, let's do some activity. Great. I want to show something. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to share my screen for a second. This is a random page from UbuWeb. Okay, it says, it might be hard to see here, but it says the UbuWeb Anthology of Conceptual Writing. I just picked this at random. Terry Atkinson and Michael Baldwin, 22 Sentences, the French Army. Here's the publication and the date, and then text from it. Okay, so here's a random page from their archive. I'm going to show you the code for this page. If you know HTML, you should quickly be able to recognize this code. If you don't, let's look at a little guide of what's going on here. This is the kind of main code for a web page. If we scroll down, these are list items and links. And then here is, oh wait, this is a different page. Give me 1 second. I'm right clicking, I'm in Firefox, I'm clicking View Page Source. Here is the code I wanted to share. This is a totally different page on the website, but it still has the same main code at the top. If we scroll down, here's that same information, and here's the text. If there was a photograph, we could put a photograph here too. The reason I'm showing this is this comes back to this thing I'm trying to emphasize, which is I think archives are made up of text largely and media as well. The media is optional. Here, this is just text. If you're Glorious Trainwrecks and you have video games, you're going to have a screenshot maybe of your video game, and you're going to have a text description. You know, again, you don't have to make your archive that way, but I just want to show that these archives are largely built of text, and we can scrape text or we can copy and paste text. The way I wanted us to get started, I've created this board.net page. Board.net you can think of as an alternative to Google Docs. It is, just gonna copy and paste this into the chat. And we're all anonymous here, or you can enter your name. What I wanted to start out with, starting question is, what are some of the archives you'd like to start? You'd like to start, or collections or communities you're part of that you think are worthy of archiving. So this is just the first one, just to kind of get us started. What are some of the things we'd want to archive? And I put the link to this in the chat. It's okay to put a personal archive too. I'm going to put my own personal archive, actually. One second. If you just joined and are not sure what we're doing, there's a link in the chat here. I can drop it again, where we're writing some things that we're thinking about archiving, or things that would make good archives, things that we're prompted by. I'm sharing my screen so you could also just watch too, but if you want to participate, we're in that board right now. Thank you, Dina. David, we're in the middle of a workshop, which you're welcome to join if you'd like, on archiving
Oh.
creative communities online.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I know. I think this is the first time I've actually met you. Like, I know who you are. I see
Yeah.
the whole thing. I'm like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, okay. I see. You're just not sure what time the schedule is, you mean?
Yes. Like, I'm realizing. Oh, I need to resync on this because I blocked off time for certain things. And
Are you trying to translate to GMT in your head?
whatever happened, whatever I did last week. No. My problem, like, I'm trying to. What does Einstein say? Whatever your problems with math, I assure you mine are far greater. Yeah, this is an advanced calendar confusion problem.
Gotcha. I have that too. Okay, looks like people have stopped. We have, oh no, I'll give another few minutes.
No, it's fine.
Okay, I'm going to read through some of these. Okay, so the question was, or my prompt was, what are some of the archives you'd like to start, or collections, or communities you're part of that you think are worthy of archiving? Unconference 2023. ELO salons. Time is tough. Yeah, climate change digital fictions. Is that? Oh man, that would be so cool. I don't know what Alan says. The text with Atkinson Baldwin's and the actual look might be important. They were part of art and language, I think. Okay, so some of these I don't even know. Pandemic debris and signage. Yes. The experiences of people knowing the world before the internet and then experiencing the internet now. Interesting. An RFC, an archive of the request for is it request for contribution, RFC of the internet and the back materials for each of them. Darius Kazemi actually has an archiving project of the early internet RFCs. I'll put his name in the chat. He did it for the Mozilla Foundation a few years ago. Darius Kazemi's RFC project. That's not the title of it, but I just, if you type that into a search, you should hopefully find it. An archive of 19th century family photo albums. Most of these get destroyed, it's true. An archive of high school graduation yearbook comments. Most of these are thrown out, yes. In my family, we're trying to archive my grandmother's photographs from like Coney Island in the 1920s and other kind of family materials. Subversive digital fictions where they're not supposed to exist, like Amazon's Bic for Her pen reviews, fake customer services accounts on socials. Yes, totally. Twitter before it gets destroyed. I believe Twitter is archived in various ways. Mastodon, yeah, I don't know if that's getting archived. We want to archive all those pictures of dinners people ate on Facebook. My grandmother saved the menu from her cross-Atlantic trip, and I still have that, so I'm not sure. You can export your Facebook archive when you leave, or even if you don't leave. It produces lots of metadata and files and images that's really hard to sift through, sort of like stepping into a basement. Oh, okay. David points out that the Library of Congress stopped archiving the whole of Twitter in 2018. That's interesting. That's an interesting point. Fanzines. Yes, lots of zines are not archived. Some are. That's a great, to my mind, this would be something that'd be great to archive using archive.org. Dean is pointing out the day-to-day world has never been totally archived. Though some artists have tried, some experimental people have tried to write down literally everything they do all day. The filmmaker who does How To with John Wilson. So John Wilson, for example, has done that. And there's a few other people that have done archives of their lives that way. Collaborative fictions like creepypastas, various wikis, SCP Foundation. Locative fiction, it's place-based fiction. Independent forms of digital fiction. Reader experiences with Flash works. The Next is amazing and even has archives of archives. Okay, I'll have to check that out. An archive of my experimental interactive website projects, links to them, screenshots, and one-sentence descriptions. An archive of netprovs. Some of the 1990s webcam folks who were on the web all the time reminds me of Ted Nelson's archives of every moment of his life. There's a documentary, We Live in Public, that's kind of on that topic as well. We could think of a documentary as a form of archiving. An archive of the mini code golf art community that previously or still existed on Twitter, creating small, strange animated images and text poems. An archive of National Novel Generating Month, NaNoGenMo, currently exists mostly in GitHub issues, not the most publicly facing or engaging. Federation, which is a 30-plus-year-old multiplayer text game. And then someone wrote everything. Okay, some of us are thinking big, some of us are thinking small. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to do here. The next thing I wanted to do is, the next question are going back to my presentation here. Okay, so the first thing was kind of like what communities we want to preserve. The next question here is thinking through one or more of the things that you wrote on this list. What do you want to preserve? I'm going to write what materials. So that can be a funny word for digital materials. What digital materials do you want to preserve? So that's the next question. So pick one of the ones that you wrote above or one that somebody else wrote. What are you trying to preserve here? So for example, I'll pick one that I selected here. I said an archive of National Novel Generating Month entries currently exists mostly in GitHub issues. In my mind, GitHub issues is not very publicly accessible. So what do I want to preserve? I probably want to preserve a list of the entries by year with a description and a link to them.
So for those of you just on sound, Lee is typing in collaborative digital fictions, text files of the forums, reviews, discussions, but also screenshots of the same, as some are highly linked to images.
I didn't write that, someone else did, but it's great. I'm going to link again to this board if you just joined. We're in a text file on the internet. And the question that we're addressing is, what digital materials do you want to preserve? Thinking through a community that you're a part of or are interested in or a fan of, what are the materials you'd want to preserve from that community? If you want to make it simpler for yourself, that's not the right word. I keep using the word simple and I want to get away from that word. If you want to create a starter archive, what would that be for yourself? Would it be a description of the community and a selection of examples? What might that look like? Someone in the file is pointing out that they're afraid that all digital materials will leave soon or not be available in a century. The energy needed for digital preservation computers and hardware and software are going to disappear. This might also be, you might also want to do a print work. You might want to think through, what does a zine of, as an archive, mean to you? What would be in that zine? Oh, I have one here I want to show, actually. I'm holding up 55 Norfolk Street by Tim Devon. It says Magical Spaces #2. Come take a tour of Cambridge's creative and political underground without ever leaving. This is a half fold in the United States, 8.5 by 11 zine. On the back of it, it says, a tiny one-floor storefront near Cambridge's busy Central Square has been home to more than its share of radicals and artists. Let's take a look at their world and see how this one small space made it all possible. Features stories about 55 Norfolk Street's magical past, including the Mobius Artist Group, a radical tenants' rights group called Eviction Free Zone, 2 performance art spaces, a couple rent strikes, and a maverick gallery run by future Zeitgeist kingpin Al Nidell, and a politically radical player piano busker known as Piano Dave. Includes info from interviews with, and it lists a bunch of names, published by Free the Future Press, Somerville, Mass. 2021. So this is a digital zine, it's not online. It has an introduction about this physical alternative art space. It goes on for a few pages, some black and white photos, and descriptions of some of the art spaces that shared this building, including photos and descriptions of all of them. So I don't want us to underestimate zines as archives as well. I know I'm covering a lot of different kinds of material, but this is another great approach, I think, as well. And anything that's done that you lay out on the computer, you could also publish to the internet in various ways. Anything you work with online, you might want to consider, how does it get printed out? Okay, I'm going to read through some of the responses here. What digital materials do you want to preserve? Collaborative digital fictions, text files of the forums, reviews, discussions, but also screenshots of the same. Some are highly linked to images. Systems of metadata for whatever it is I'm archiving. Nano Genmo entries, lists of each entry linked to each work, short description or screenshot. Screenshot is the question. Versions of text as evolution and all the collaboration and collaborative dynamics on it. I'm afraid that all digital materials will leave soon or not be available in a century, as the energy needed for digital preservation, computers and hardware and software are going to disappear soon. Someone else says, I made a hyperbook sort of related to this. The internet fake news destroys the world. Feel free to link to that if you'd like. Federation, early material and community management, including material from AOL internal mailing lists and staff manuals, web archives of fan player sites, original interactive broadcasting website, code changes and design changes to the game over time indexing and cross references to the various sources of info, scanned images of player made maps and design sketches. This makes me think a little bit about the Doom community. Who have websites and publish, to this day, links to Doom WADs that you could download. I don't know what that stands for, but I know that those are like the individual games and levels that people make and publish to the internet that can be played through modern software. Might be worth looking at how they do it, or the ZZT Museum, for example. Someone wrote, I printed out my small works, but these created an entirely new working experience. We have to think about how people experience these archives differently. I think that's true. One of my favorite places to view exhibits of archives is HKW in Berlin, which often presents these kind of incredible archival exhibits, particularly of previously marginalized communities and often creative communities. Dean is pointing to this archives mother. I don't know what that is yet. I'm excited to check out these links. And then lastly, someone wrote, who are we archiving for, and do they want the archives? Which is a great question. Okay, the next question I have. Which is, how do we want to archive? Do we want to piggyback on the Internet Archive's ability to upload things? I could even show you what that looks like. Do we have some coding skills, some web development skills where we can do some HTML and CSS and templates? Again, I'll show the Ubu website. I know that Kenneth Goldsmith, what he writes is that he starts with an old page. He takes the code from that page and he replaces the content. So if he's making a new page, like in this, let's jump to a different section. Okay, let's say we're looking at the visual poetry section. And there's an introduction to this section. And then if we click on one of them, I'm going to click on, I don't even know what this is, Postmodern Decadence in Canadian Sound and Visual Poetry. Okay, this is a very simple page with a link to a PDF, a year and a date. Okay, I'm going to jump back for a second. So that one was fairly minimal. I'm going to click on Poor Old Tired Horse. Ian Hamilton Finlay's Poor Old Tired Horse is one of the most important visual poetry magazines internationally. The magazine began to publish an increasing amount of visual poetry, starting with issue 5. Finlay would eventually distance himself from visual poetry in favor of his Wild Hawthorne Press, Poetic Objects, and his monumental Little Sparta. So there's the title here, there's a description, there's PDFs, and then there's text description below. I think this whole entire website it'd be great if they had OCR software, but I have a feeling this one is, yeah. So this could actually be scanned with OCR software. That would be a good project to do. I'm going to jump to one of these ones that has a visual one. In any case, what I'm trying to show is the way Kenneth Goldsmith starts. He starts with the previous page's code. He copies it and just changes out the content. He puts in images and text. That's it every time. So going back here to my presentation here, if you have some code skills, that's one approach you could take. Another is, again, just plain text, descriptions, and photos. So the question here is, uh-oh, did I lose my page? Yes, I did. I'm going to scroll up and grab it again. So the question here is, how do we want to archive? Do you want to use the Internet Archive? And this is to think through one of these archives you're interested in building or working on, or that you wish would exist. What approach might you take? Is it just writing some text files? Do you need to find someone else to partner with you? Would it exist just on your computer? Do you want to piggyback on the Internet Archive? So that's what we're addressing here. And feel free to keep putting stuff into the chat. I hope we can harvest this chat as well afterwards as an archive of comments and feedback. And Lyle's nodding yes, so that's good. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I know people are still writing, which is great. How do we want to archive? Someone in the document wrote, do we want archives to be accessible? And another person wrote, I wish there was an archive button that would just copy the web page or digital object, put it somewhere on a cloud with forms for metadata. The Wayback Machine has something sort of like this. There is Archive It, which is a more industrial tool by the Internet Archive. They do have a fee to use it, though they have indicated if you contact them, they'd be willing to kind of share this as well. It's like a more industrial form that does have the ability to do metadata than just the Wayback Machine on its own, which is the free product that they have. And then there's some commiserating over the challenges of archiving too. And could we get a time machine and go interview future folks to find out what they want archived? All good questions. Just to wrap up here, thanks so much for everyone that was participating today. If you have ideas, comments, collaborations, please contact me. I'm really interested in talking about this topic. I myself think of myself as an armchair archivist. You know, I'm a professor of new media and computer science. I have a background in museums, and I've worked with DIY communities, both online and physical, for the past 20 years, actually. So I'm really interested in this topic, but there's still lots to learn. I have a long-term project on this, and we'll be putting out more resources online and in print over the year ahead. You can find me on my website, Lee Tusman. I have a podcast, Artists and Hackers. You can find me on Mastodon or Instagram. I'm also on Instagram under my own name, Lee Tusman, and under many other monikers. Thanks so much, everyone here. This was recorded, I heard, so there'll be an archive of this, and as well as the chat. I really appreciate everyone participating today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lee. Yay. And could you just go ahead and put those links into the chat itself so that we can copy and paste?
Yep.
Thank you. But thank you very much. Archiving is quite important, and you do need to get with Deanie. You two have a lot to talk about.
Great.